Zoom environment. Thank you so much. My apologies.
Okay, so before I get started, I just today literally figured out how to share my screen in Zoom and see the chat. So if you want to ask a question, feel free to type it in the chat. I will have that open, or go ahead and just speak up during my lecture. I'm more than happy to answer all of your questions. I really appreciate it when I have some interaction with the audience. To give you a little bit of an idea who I am, and I'm going to use this slide to do that. So I'm a principal lecturer at the West Campus of Arizona State University, where I've taught for the last 20 years a large number of plant classes, general biology classes, statistics for biology majors, and philosophy of biology courses. Before that, I spent 10 years as a contract biologist. So I've literally walked across the Mojave Desert chasing desert tortoises. Notice I said walked because they're tortoises. Spent a summer hooting like an owl in southern Utah to count spotted owls, and then ended that part of my career by being a senior natural resource specialist on the United States Army's Yuma Proving Ground, helping the Army comply with environmental laws. So I've seen a lot of this desert, done most of my research in it. My master's, I looked at how fire affects cactus communities and how cactus communities recover from fire. And my doctorate, I did looking at lichens, which I'm sure all of you understand are actually a combination of a fungi and an algae growing. The ones I looked at grow on rocks, and we use them as monitors for metal air pollution. And I looked at air pollution patterns here in Maricopa County and in the Grand Canyon region. Happy to tell you our Grand Canyon stacks up pretty nicely with all other areas in the world that have very limited to no pollution. So we still have some clean areas. So tonight, I was asked to give a class about cacti, and I titled it Bitter and Prickly because I want to talk about the, bad lichen pun in the chat. Bad. Thank you. I want to talk, the plants I use pictures of tonight come from Arizona State University's, mostly their vascular plant herbarium, but it's from SciNet. So I don't know if all of you are familiar with SciNet. Is the Southwest Environmental Information Network. And not only do they have digitized all the plant collections of Southwest, they actually have a really neat dynamic key that can help you key plants even if you don't have floral flowers with you. So what I want to talk about tonight are cacti, and I thought I'd do it kind of species by species, while throwing in there, I don't know, some biochemistry and maybe some evolutionary biology. So this is a saguaro. On the right, we see an adult. This was taken in the Desert Botanic Garden. On the left, we see a juvenile. The juvenile picture was taken, let's just say a long time ago, at South Mountain Park. Now, if you look closely at the one on the right, you'll notice that there are actual holes in it, right? Now, these holes are made by woodpeckers. Here in the desert Southwest, most of the time, the woodpecker that you're going to see drilling into those is the Gila woodpecker or the gilded flicker. Now, notice closely, I'm going to move my cursor over it. Notice closely, these holes tend to be down away from the tip of the branch. That is, if you're familiar with the taking apart of saguaro, so let's actually go and skip around a little bit here into saguaro anatomy. You know, its folds like an accordion allow it to expand and contract with its changing water processes. You probably also know that behind each one of those folds is a wooden, we call them ribs, but really what they are the vascular tissue, is the tissue that the plant uses to move water from the roots out the stem. So behind those folds are the ribs. Here, the whole point of this, I'm getting there, here in the middle, they're very thick, and it's the Gila woodpecker that can make its nest here in the lower parts of the arms. The gilded flicker, because it has a slightly less stout beak, has to put its nests near the top, where this one is here. Now, this particular saguaro in the Desert Botanic Garden, it wouldn't surprise me if these were all Gila woodpecker nests. But I bring this example up. If you ever make it to southwestern Arizona, to the Camino Diablo, yes, the Devil's Highway, if you ever are lucky enough to take that trip, you'll see a lot of saguaros out there where the top is actually collapsed, so it's kind of bent over. And that's because that gilded flicker nest ended up collapsing under its own weight. So that's how you can actually tell which of the two woodpeckers are nesting in it. Most of what we see down here is definitely the Gila woodpecker. So as I understand it, for some reason, the woodpecker will only live there for 1 year. and one nesting season, and then it moves out. I don't know that there's any research on it, but really I strongly suspect it probably has something to do with nest parasites and avoiding such things. But usually other birds will move in. If you're talking about out in the desert, you will have like an elf owl. If we were down in Mexico, maybe a ferruginous pygmy owl that will move in. Here in the city, unfortunately, more often than not, you see starlings moved in. And starlings, for those of you who don't know, are in America because there were a group of people in the 19th century that believed every creature that was ever mentioned in a Shakespeare play should live in America. And they released starlings in New York Park, in Central Park. Took them actually 2 or 3 times to get them established. Once they did, though, they spread throughout America. So, gift from Europe. How many of you have ever seen a crested saguaro? Okay. So crested saguaros are quite rare. Probably only about 1 out of 100,000. Probably only 1 out of 100,000 does. And we don't exactly know why. Now, we have an idea of the mechanics of it, and let me tell you why. So you all are familiar with plants. Plants have only certain parts of the body that grow, what we call meristems. If you go outside your Palo Verde tree and you chop one of those branches off, it will never grow again from where it was cut, right? It has to come out of a bud from near the base of a leaf. So in the saguaro, the meristem cells are programmed, if you will, their genetic program is to only divide in a certain plane, and thus it only grows up. Something broke those instructions. Something then told the cells it's also appropriate to divide outward. And that, if you look at where the cursor is, that's what has to be causing these crests. Now, what did that? How was that genetic? You ever seen a saguaro that looks like the ninja hacked the tip off with a sword? Yes, and a lot of times that can be caused by a creature we call a drunk redneck. Otherwise, you can see saguaros will get struck by lightning occasionally, and that does tend to actually only destroy the top of it. It doesn't tend to kill the entire plant, so you will see some with tops hacked off that were actually victimized by lightning. Yeah, I haven't been to Ironwood BLM in a long time, but I would suspect a number of them are actually from monsoon season lightning strikes. All right, so what are we looking at here? I didn't know any better back when I took this picture. This picture literally comes from the early 90s because I took this picture while I was doing my master's research. There is nothing at all in this scene to make me think that these are legal saguaros, right? If you want to plant a saguaro in your yard, you better have a tag, or you can do like I did and get one that's this big from the Desert Botanic Gardens, plant it in my front yard, give it love and affection and 13 years, and now it's about 3 feet tall, right? I mean, that is one way. This, though, well, what I wanted to show you with these slides is if you were to dig up a saguaro, if you're actually going to bring it out of the ground, it has 2 different parts to its root system. The first part, it does have a taproot, but that taproot only extends about a meter, about 3 feet into the soil. And taproot probably only helps stabilize the saguaro when it's younger. The majority of the root system, though, is a surface root system. It's going to exist in about the top 8 inches to 12 inches of the soil, but it will extend out from the base of that plant pretty much as far as the plant is tall. In fact, most of the biomass of a wild saguaro is probably in its root system, not above ground as we think of that. When they transplant them, they cut almost the entire root system off. This is why you have to have them propped up. If you're out and about and you want to tell the easy difference to tell a saguaro that's been transplanted versus one that's grown wild. Wild ones, and start to look at this and you'll sort of see it, but the wild ones, they actually come and narrow in, quite narrow at the base. Whereas a transplanted one, because they have to bury part of the stem to stabilize it, the sides almost come straight into the ground. And you start to look at that, and you'll be able to tell really easy where the transplanted saguaros are. So, yeah, I never turned these people in, and now I'm sure it's way too late. But when I took the picture, I just didn't know better. I wanted a picture like this because even back in those days, I did classes like these and used these in some of my educational classes. This one, though, is quite old. All right. So bitter. Let's start with that first word, the title of the talk. Why are cacti bitter? Now, I know you are good people and you don't stab cacti with knives to get some of the sap out of them. But if you did, they are somewhat acidic depending on the time of day. And that's what's really interesting. So cacti, and let's take your typical cactus like a saguaro, uses a metabolic pathway that we're going to call crassulacean acid metabolism. And crassulacean is simply a different family of succulent plants. They actually are from the old world, right? Had cacti been the first plant that the scientists looked at to describe this metabolism, CAM would stand for cactus acid metabolism. So this is found in a lot of succulents that live in hot environments. So what the plant does is literally, let's start in a 24-hour day cycle. So let's say it's sunset right now, sunset. As the sun goes down, the plant opens up its stomata, it opens up its breathing pores and starts exchanging gas with the atmosphere. And what it has to do is it has to start pulling in carbon dioxide. And it starts actively taking that carbon dioxide and making it into oxaloacetate, a 4-carbon compound. I'm not going to test you about biochemistry, so don't be scared. But it starts storing that as malic acid. And it stores it, stores it, stores it, stores it, stores it. So that by the time the sun rises, it's stored quite a bit of acid, and indeed the tissues are somewhat acidic. Then when the sun rises, the plant closes its stomata, it closes its breathing pores, holds its breath all day, and uses that malic acid to convert it back into carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. So the upshot of this is the plant doesn't breathe during the day, and this is why it can save water and exist in this dry environment. It also helps us understand why some cacti grow slower than others. So like a saguaro uses strictly CAM photosynthesis. So every day it closes its pores, every night it opens them. Choyas and prickly pear, on the other hand, if water is plentiful, will actually leave their stomata open in the daytime and use a more efficient form of photosynthesis called C3 photosynthesis and grow faster. And this is why cholla and prickly pear can grow faster, because when water is plentiful, they can take advantage of that and up their photosynthetic rate, or photosynthetic efficiency, actually. Because you see, C4 photosynthesis is not as efficient as C3, but it allows the plant to save water. And that is a more important thing in the desert. How much does it save? A typical saguaro probably uses 1/5 the water that equivalent C3 plant is using. What it also allows for is something called CAM cycling. So how many of you are familiar with the Carnegie Research Lab that used to be located in southern Arizona? Anyone? How many of you know what the Desert Sonoran Museum is? It's the same thing. So that was originally a Carnegie Research Lab funded by Carnegie. And one of the outgrowths of that lab, what is the Latin name of the saguaro? Carnegia gigantea. That's why it's Carnegia, because scientists associated with that project and with that grant funding were the ones that described the saguaro as belonging to its own unique genus and named it in honor of Carnegia. So how do the current extreme temperatures affect the process? We don't know, but certainly being that they're at the extremes of their survival, as most creatures are in nature, it's probably not that good. For saguaros, though, I think the biggest worry is recruitment, actually, not photosynthetic metabolism. So CAM cycling, at this Carnegie Research Lab down in Tucson, they took a barrel out of the ground. And they took that barrel out of the ground, they put it on a gurney, they put it in the lab, they're going to do something with it. But you know, we scientists, we absent-minded professors, we forget about things. 3 years later, the barrel's still on the gurney, and they weigh it, and it's lost less than 3% of the weight, and it's still perfectly alive. How does it do that? I mean, another example of this kind of behavior, my old master's professor, Duncan Patton, he's moving in the early spring. He's moving some prickly pear. He throws the pads in a box. He throws the box in the garage, in the new garage, forgets about it, opens the box in October, and inside that box, those prickly pear have fruit on them. They have flowered and they have fruited in a box unattached to the ground. Well, what happens is CAM cycling is where the plant's like, you know what? I don't have to breathe in the day or the night. And so it uses the carbon dioxide from its respiration for photosynthesis and the oxygen from its photosynthesis for respiration, and it gets into this virtuous cycle that allows it to stay metabolically active, but consume almost no water. Now, this is a huge advantage in this desert. Compare this to something like triangle leaf burr sage. In the hottest of the summer, triangle leaf burr sage actually shuts down its metabolic machinery. It goes into like a state of summer restoration. And when the first monsoon rains hit, it can take as much as 2 weeks before that plant wakes up and starts photosynthesizing. A saguaro or an agave, on the other hand, that are using this crassulacean acid metabolism will literally be growing new root hairs within 20 hours of the rain falling and are immediately able to power up photosynthesis. So it's a really good advantage to living in an arid environment with the kind of spotty rain that we see. I mean, if it takes me 2 weeks to power up my metabolism before I take advantage of this water, it may be dried by then, right? Think of your monsoon rains. But if I can power up immediately, I can use even the briefest of monsoon rainstorm to replenish my water supplies. And this is something we think most cacti can actually do. All right, so let's talk about the barrel cactus, right? This is one of the most famous cactus. Who can name a movie that this plant starred in? You know, officially as a native of Arizona, I can actually officially have you all deported at this point because it's a John Wayne movie, and here in Arizona, you know, John Wayne is almost saint-like, almost saint-like. Oh, so how many of you ever heard of the John Wayne movie, The Three Godfathers? This is a classic John Wayne movie. It's one of the few movies he plays a bad guy. Okay, and in the movie, you are right, Nicole. You are correct. I'm going to jump conversations quickly here. The Tohono O'odham oftentimes refer to, and the saguaro is very important in their culture. Now, that's something I didn't speak about, but if we go back to the saguaro, I'm sorry to skip around. If you're aware, the O'odham people actually harvested the fruit, right? So the plant flowers in May. It's got a beautiful white flower. If it's a white flower, who pollinates it?
Bats.
Bats and?
Moths.
Moths.
Because it's pollinated at night, right? So this is actually the traditional ideas we have sold people on what we call pollinator syndromes, that certain organisms are adapted to certain flowers. I've taught this all of my academic career until recently because you see, my wife is a pollination biologist, literally spends her research time chasing bees. And what she tells me is every time they've done research to try to actually provide support for these syndromes, they're not finding it. You'll find things like bees in the middle of the day pollinating saguaros. You'll find things, I've seen honeybees on Bermuda, and I've always told people Bermuda grasses win. So there's a lot more to that than meets the eye. But after it's pollinated, it forms its fruit. Fruit's like about the size of a hen's egg. And the O'odham people would harvest it by using the ribs of dead saguaros and tying a little piece in the top and use that to knock the fruit down. They made a lot of different things with the fruit. They ate the seeds as well, and it was really a very central part of their culture. All right, let me get back to my barrels now. So I was talking about the John Wayne movie, and the reason I want to talk about this is because I'm sure many of you have ever been asked or told, can you get water from a barrel cactus? All right, and a lot of that actually comes from this John Wayne movie. So John Wayne and his buddies, it's one of the few John Wayne movies he's a bad guy. They rob a bank. They're out in the middle of the desert. The sheriff has put his posse at the water holes. They come across a wagon train that had been ambushed by Apaches. The only person left alive is a woman who's 9 months pregnant. She goes into labor, dies while delivering the baby. So now these bank robbers have a baby with them, hence the name of the movie. It's The Three Godfathers. And at that point, John Wayne says, you know, we could find one of them barrel cactus. I think we'd be okay. Rides over a ridge, and there's a field of barrel cacti. It's a miracle because if I remember the Ruby correctly, they're only about 2 days out of Dodge City, Kansas. And if I do my math, and I'm on a horse, and I'm in Dodge City, Kansas, I don't think I can get anywhere close to the Sonoran Desert. But John Wayne, remember, has this power on his side that is unstoppable, and that is the scriptwriter. So John walks up to that barrel cactus. He pulls the machete he always keeps on his hip, takes one swing and chops the top off, grabs the little tin cup that hangs on the side of every barrel in a Hollywood movie, and starts scooping cold water out of it. He takes a drink, his buddies take a drink, they give the horses a drink, they take one of the gloves, put a hole in a finger with a knife, and there they've got a nipple, and now the baby gets a drink, and then they plow a couple acres and set out a crop and irrigate, and just amazing amounts of water. How many of you have ever seen the inside of a barrel? Now, it's not that exciting. If you were to look inside, it looks like the green part of a watermelon rind, right? But because, remember that crassulacean acid metabolism, because this plant is storing CO2 as acid all the time, it's just slightly acidic. If you were to pick a chunk of it out and squeeze it, you wouldn't get a water out of it. You get something that more looks like what comes out of a horse's nose, because the plant has complexed that water up into with these compounds called mucopolysaccharides that make it hard for the water to leave the cells. Everything about this plant is adapted to holding on to every last bit of water it can. Let's say you were so desperate you drank that cactus slime. If you're lucky, it will cause your throat, or it will cause your tongue to swell up enough that it will block your throat and you will suffocate and die a relatively painless death. Because otherwise, it's more likely than not to induce vomiting and diarrhea. Both are horrible ways to retain water. So the stories we have of getting water out of this plant are simply Western mythology, right? Plus, if you've ever handled a barrel, you know one swing with a knife is just going to bounce off that damn thing. Those spines are stouter than anything. I estimate it would take 4 or 5 hours of hard work to cut the top one of these off. And I don't know about you, but if I had to work 4 or 5 hours in 110 degrees without a drink, I think I'd be dead at the end of it. So getting water out of them when you're lost is just simply not a good idea. One of the many nicknames this plant gets is compass barrel. And if you go out in nature, and you pull like here, I'll show you what kind of data science sound. You pull 100 saguaros and average the way they lean, it's going to be strongly biased to the south, all right? And this is why it gets called the compass cactus. Also why they get called sometimes the suicide cactus. Because you see they can lean so far to the south that maybe there's a heavy monsoon rain that slightly washes out some of the roots, and they pull in all this water and poof, they fall over. If you've hiked a lot in the desert, you'll have seen more than one barrel that has fallen over. We know why this happens. So the plant is growing up. If you are in the northern hemisphere, this is something that the ecologists will call the north-south slope effect. If you're in the northern hemisphere, the sun is almost always to the south of us, right? So when the sun strikes the southern half of the barrel, it causes that half of the barrel to do two things. The first thing it does is it starts synthesizing the plant growth hormone auxin. The second thing it does is it shifts that auxin to the opposite side. This causes the north side to grow faster and thus points the cactus to the south. And there's no research justifying this, but I have a hypothesis as to why. If it's pointing at the sun, it is minimizing its solar exposure. When you're outside in the summertime, what's the first thing most rational people look for? Shade. And so minimizing a solar exposure is even important for these plants. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Yes, Kara, the barrel cactus will make you sick, and it's a protected plant by law. Don't stab them. Don't stab them. You know, honestly, all the stories. You know, I'm not a spring chicken by any means, but the stories we all heard and the advice we exchanged in my younger years about how to be ready for getting lost in the desert or how to survive, they're great things. But please, this is the 21st century. Use your cell phone. Bring some water, and honestly, it's hard now to find a place that's not covered by cell phone coverage. Most of the places that I used to go and knew that had problems with cell phone now, I can be up there very easily. So it's really a different world. Ooh, I sound old. Okay, I'll stop that. I want to talk about a few other species of cactus. So this is why we know that the cacti are bitter, is this crassulacean acid metabolism, and it works really well. So closely related to the saguaro are these organ pipe cactus, Stenoserius thurberi. They don't seem to grow well here in Phoenix. I've tried to keep some alive in my front yard, and I've failed. They do, of course, grow well in Organ Pipe National Monument, which is south of us. So they may need warmer weather. And indeed, with the way climate change is going, in a few more years, maybe I'll be trying to grow one again and more successful. They have a very similar life cycle to the saguaro in that they will flower with large white flowers in late May, early June. And then they will put the same kinds or similar types of fruit. You can actually see on this picture at the tips what are fruit up here. So this picture had to have been taken sometime in either late June or early July. You know, it's interesting to think about reproductive strategies and the different way organisms go about it. I say that because as somebody who studied plants, it's a radically different strategy than us humans. You know, we humans have a couple of kids, and especially those of us in places like America have a good expectation that the vast majority of them will become adults themselves. Think about what this plant does. So right now this plant has on it, let's take a swag. Swag is a scientific wild ass guess. It's got about 40 fruit on it. And that's probably maybe, let's say, 40% of what it can grow a year. So let's say it grows 100 fruit a year. Each one of those fruit are going to have 2,000 seeds. So each year it's putting out 2 million seeds. How many years is this going to live? 60, 80, 100, 120. So let's say 100. So now we have 200 million seeds, 200 million children, because that's what a seed is. A seed is an embryo. A seed is an embryo. And if it's lucky, 2 of them will become an adult. That's the reproductive strategy that plants use, and it's radically different. I mean, we care for our children till they're 18 or even longer. A plant does, okay, here's some food in your seed, see ya, wouldn't want to be ya. So it's a radically different reproductive strategy. I mean, you know, think about, if you will, the deal that some plants like wheat or corn made with humans. Now, wheat and corn will have millions of children and allow us to eat 99% of them, as long as we plant that other 1% and keep their species going. All right. So another close, oh, go ahead.
Are organ pipe cacti also CAM only?
Yes, yes, all cacti are CAM capable. It seems like only the choyas can actually revert to C3. The larger and slower growing ones seem to be, and now let me emphasize, seem to be. Right? No one's actually sat down and done the complicated biochemistry work that would need to do to justify this. But based on growth rates, I would say it's only the choyas that you see C3 being used again in. So how's that for providing a logical sounding answer but with no actual data to back it up? Well, I bring this up because something we've discovered in the sciences is that there are a lot of things that we all believe. And they started by somebody saying, wow, here's a situation, here's my hypothesis, like what I just did. Here's my hypothesis. And because it sounded so good, we just accepted it and never tested it. You know, one of the examples I have about that is with actually the kangaroo rats that live in this desert. We'd always assumed that they went as deep as possible and only used the coolest parts of night as possible in the summer in order to survive, because this is an animal that does not drink in the summertime. There's a research paper that came out in the last 10 years that shows, no, they don't. They actually are active right after sunset. They're active in warmer parts of the ground. And all those assumptions we made are just not supported by the data. So as a scientist, I really want to emphasize, yeah, I've got some good guesses. Don't believe anything until it's tested. All right. So organ pipe, here's another relative of it, the Sonita, also called an old man cactus. And the reason it got called old man cactus, if you look closely at these older branches that are sticking out, they're covered with a much denser amount of spines and longer spines. And some of the first settlers, I guess, or I guess the Spaniards that came to America, yeah, Sonita, thought that looked like the beard of an old man. So do I look like a cactus? I've always found some of the common names of cacti to be when you looked at it, I guess I would say you were in the desert in the heat too long when you thought that name up. In any event, very, very similar to the organ pipe. This one too seems to prefer climates a little bit south of Phoenix, although it is used in landscaping. Interestingly enough, I see from the chat you like my swag. You know, I do have to be honest and say it is an improvement on the WAG, which is simply a wild ass guess. But this is the kind of this is the kind of innovation that ASU pushes. if you look at cacti here in the valley, if you look at cacti in landscaping, the vast majority of cacti we use here are actually South American species. And the reason why is, of course, they look exotic, because we don't recognize them from our desert. So a large number of the decorative cacti you see that you're not used to seeing, say, at the Desert Botanic Garden, on the Sonoran Trail, or when you hike the desert, those generally tend to be South American species. I wanted to talk about some of the cacti that hide. So this is our night blooming cereus, Peniocereus greggii. And if you ever saw it, you can see there in the bottom right, this is a close-up of its stem. They actually look like dead sticks, and they're almost always found growing inside of another bush, or inside, like you see on this picture on the left, inside of this Palo Verde tree. The only time really they get noticed is when they put these flowers on. So they will flower at night. They will only open for not even 24 hours. They only open for a few hours. After that, they will shut. And generally speaking, they're pollinated and they produce fruit. So here you actually see fruit on it. And again, this fruit should remind you, it should look very similar to the saguaro fruit or the organ pipe fruit or the like. Fruits across all cacti look very, very similar. Even the barrel fruit, although they can take on some different colors, look very similar. Yeah, the fruit, and I'm not sure about this cactus because it was so rare, but maybe there are reports that the natives would dig this one up for its root. It's one of the cacti whose taproot is not just a straight long root like a saguaro, but is actually like more like a turnip, and it is a storage for carbohydrate. So this one I have read has been eaten by Indians. I never would, because I've only seen so few of them, and I think their flowers are so beautiful that I would never have the heart to dig one up. Of course, you know it's illegal to do that on public land, so we should not. So let's talk about prickly. Let's talk about prickly. You have spines, you have thorns, you have prickles. In my younger day, when I took a stand, and I took a stand for what I believed in, I got very offended when somebody said a cactus had a thorn, right? They don't have thorns, they have spines. Well, what is the difference between a spine, a thorn, and a prickle, and who cares? The second question is really easy to answer. Me and a handful of other botanists. My wife, who's sitting in the room, just chuckled at me because she'll actually call a cactus a thorn. Sometimes I think just to irritate me, but that's fun. So the difference between the two is that a spine, like what you see here in this center picture, is a modified leaf. And a thorn, what you see over here, is a modified stem tissue. All right? So if you look at this picture down here, this on the left, A, is the thorn. So you have the leaf here, and coming out where the axillary bud is, where you'll have replication of cells, where new growth can come out of. If that's the armament, that's a thorn. But if we look over here, we have the leaf here, and below the leaf, or we have a bud growing here, excuse me, that's not a leaf, that's a bud growing here, and below that bud, we have the armament. This is a leaf, so this is a spine. Now here you have a tree, and it has modified epidermal tissue. These are prickles. It doesn't really matter what you call them, but what I think is interesting to note is this means that a defense system of sharp, stabby things, you know, let me use some plain language, has evolved multiple times. So it must be a really good way for a plant to protect itself. Interestingly enough, if you look closely at the famous rose, those aren't thorns, those are prickles. But apparently Shakespeare did not have the help of a evolutionarily educated botanist, and so we will talk about roses and thorns. At cacti, we actually think the spines, so let's go back here to a good cactus picture. We think the spines do a number of other things to help defend the plant. I mean, first and foremost, they're armed to the teeth, right? You and I may not be able to get water out of that barrel, but some of our desert rodents whose kidneys are so efficient that they don't urinate liquid, they urinate a paste, can get water out of those plants, right? So the spines have to defend them, they work well. What they also do, especially when you see thick ones like this, and we'll talk about in a little bit the cholla, what they also do is help reflect sunlight and shade the plant. And finally, notice how that barrel has like a blanket of spines around it. So the air that's around it probably doesn't exchange as quickly with the outside air. This is what ecologists call a microclimate, and can actually then help slow down the rate of evaporation and act as another way that the plant preserves its moisture. All right, so I want to go on. And speaking of prickly, let's talk about jumping cholla, all right? Do cholla jump? Does this plant move? Rebecca, I see you shaking your head. No, you are correct. These spines end in very fine points, and it's oftentimes hard to see them, especially as we get older and get glasses. They're incredibly sharp. They will penetrate leather, but they're also covered with microscopic reverse barbs. And so what happens is you barely brush against a piece of a cholla because those joints fall off really easy. It's attached to you, but you don't feel it yet. It's just in your clothes. Taking a few steps, because of those reverse barbs, the spine can only work its way deeper. So by the time you feel it, you're 2 or 3 steps past the plant that you got it from, and you turn around and look and you say, damn, that plant's 10 feet away. It must have jumped. It must have jumped. They don't. But this is how the plant reproduces. So the plant has not sexually reproduced in its entire life. The fruit form have seeds that are either sterile, in the case of some species, because there's 2 jumping cholla I'll talk about, or they are genetic clones of the mother plant. In animal biology, we call that parthenogenesis. In plants, we call it apomixis. But they're genetically identical. The advantage is, of course, if you think about it, a seed has to start growing and it has to start building photosynthetic machinery with just what's stored in it. So it's got a real race to kind of get itself established. But if you're a joint of cholla, you already have functional photosynthetic tissue that you can cam cycle and survive and wait until the rains come before you even drop a root into the soil. And so it makes it a much better way for this plant to survive. It makes it, though, a very vicious plant in terms of you and I. So this is why this particular species, Sonoran fulgida, is called chain fruit cholla. When you see it in the wild in a large arborescent, which is just a tree-like form, you'll have these hanging fruit that come off it in chains. From what I've seen in the wild and what I've been told by land managers, these fruit are addictive to cattle. If you're ever hiking in like the Superstition Mountains, the Tonto National Desert, and come across the cattle that are grazing out there, it's not uncommon to see cholla stuck to their snouts. Apparently, it's that tasty. This is, of course, how the cholla spreads, and I do feel sorry for those cows. Don't get me wrong, but it appears that it's almost adapted to do that. Now, this shows you one of the few animals that really love the cholla. So look closely in that cholla; you'll see a bird's nest. Our state bird, the cactus wren, will actually make her nests. Well, excuse me, his nests. In birds, it's mostly the males or both cooperatively that make nests. Probably an exception to that, but for the most part. So the cactus wren will make a nest that's actually covered on the top to shade its eggs. If you've ever seen one, they've got entrances in the side. Cactus wren will also use this cholla to defend itself. If you ever get the chance to watch, there's a National Geographic video, it goes for about 30 minutes, called The Sonoran Desert of Violent Eden. And to tell it how old it is, I bought it on VHS once. But in that video, they have a great number of scenes from the Sonoran Desert, and one is a king snake that tries to climb up this cholla to get to the wren's babies. And the mama comes out, and she ain't standing for that. She literally starts crashing into the snake's body and trying to force it into and impale it on the spines. Finally, the snake just gives up, falls off of the cholla, and slithers away with this big piece of cholla stuck to its tail. So the cactus wren really use this. Oh yeah, curve-bill thrasher carrot will also nest in them. It's a great place to nest. It really protects your young. All right, this is the second species that's called jumping. This is the teddy bear cholla. They are smaller. They generally don't get as big and tree-like as chain fruit cholla. This one has shorter spines, but probably more per square centimeter than the cholla. And again, it reproduces asexually, and this is why it's so successful. One of the surprising things out of my master's thesis research was that even though the jumping cholla, this species and the chain fruit, took the highest mortality rates from cacti, they died at the highest rates from fire, they were the quickest to come back. And I suspect that they came back the quickest because of this asexual form of reproduction. Interestingly enough, this also has provided problems for some of our range managers. So if you look at, I'm going to go back here. If you look at a cholla like this, it's an arborescent, it's tree-like. So apparently before they knew better, some ranchers, in order to clear hardwoods off of their property, would tie a chain between 2 bulldozers and drag it across land. And that's great to pull juniper trees out and some other things. What do you think happens when you do that to cholla like this? Yeah, you end up with 20 or 30 more because each one of those joints that falls is able to root and grow. So that particular brush control technique should never be used with jumping cholla. So when I was a master's student back in the day, back in the early 90s, I made some extra money on the side as a cowboy Jeep tour guide. And one of my favorite cowboy Jeep tour jokes to tell a crowd, I picked this up from the other tour guides, as you looked around, he said, now, after you told them how scary this plant is, how many of you have children? And you get some hands to come up. All right, daughters, some of the hands would stay up. Under 5, and a few hands would stay up. And you'd say to that person, you say, all right, sir, you need to take some of this cholla home. You need to plant it under your daughter's window. And it will grow into a full-size plant by the time she is a teenager, and her boyfriend will always use the front door. Needless to say, there's a lot of sexist tropes, if you will, in that one, but it is effective. It's an effective deterrent to burglary and the like if you plant these plants around your yard. All right, I want to talk about prickly pears. This is another picture from the Botanic Garden. So prickly pears and cholla used to be the same genus. They used to all be lumped in Opuntia, but Opuntia ended up being a genus with 2,000 species, and that's just too many. And so very recently it was split. If you'll notice on my previous slides, the chollas are now Cylindropuntia, the prickly pears are Opuntia. This is almost certainly Engelmannii, and this picture comes, like I said, from the Botanic Garden. You can see in this picture the red fruit here. Those fruit are edible, but the pads, this part too, are often eaten as well. The Mexicans call them napoles or napolitos. You can even, I think, buy canned napoles in a Fry's grocery store if you look closely. Some of the grocery stores in the valley will even carry them in the produce section. You gotta be careful on the spines though, right? So one of the defining traits of these two genera, Opuntia and Cylindropuntia, are something we call glockids. So look closely at this prickly pear. Notice it has these large spines, which you're all familiar with, but if we look close, the spines all come out of these little pads. We call those aerial pads. That's the axillary bud, the place in the cactus where cell division can occur. But if you look closely at some of them, especially this one right here, you notice there's a smaller set of fuzzy spines on it. And if you've ever had a close encounter with a jumping cactus or other prickly pears, you know there's two sets of spines, a large one and a small one. So the small ones are called glockids. They too are reversed barbed. They're really, I think, Mother Nature's answer to fiberglass. Because once they get into you, they are irritating and they are hard as heck to get out. I noticed in the chat, somebody said Elmer's glue works. And yes, I've heard that about Elmer's glue. I've heard that about some rubber cements that they help to pull them out. I had one tourist tell me once that if you throw vinegar on it, it'll help pull it out. But I'm like, vinegar on an open wound? Even if it works, it doesn't sound like a good idea. I try to stay away from them. Now notice here that the prickly pear pad is a very unique shape, right? We've all seen that, it's flat. Why? Well, again, I'm going to give you a scientific hypothesis. I don't have data for it, but I have some evidence. And that is to say, think about where the sun is, right? The hottest part of the day, the sun is straight above us. And these plants minimize their exposure to the sun with this shape. At sunrise or sunset, though, when the sun is close to the horizon, temperatures are cooler and photosynthesis is more efficient. And at that point in time, this shape maximizes solar exposure. So I would hypothesize that the prickly pear is adapted. This shape is adapted to maximize photosynthesis at sunrise and sunset and minimize solar exposure at high noon. Now, I've never done any research on that, but I will notice when I transplant prickly pears and use them to make fences, even if you plant the pad on an east-west orientation, they start slowly growing and all end up on a north-south orientation, which is some evidence, perhaps. Prickly pear generally don't fall apart on their own, but if you break those pads apart, they will grow on their own. Something else you should notice on this prickly pear pad, you see these little white spots like this one right here. That's not an aerial pad. That's actually an insect called a cochineal insect. Cochineal insects were the first actual economically viable product from the New World. And the reason why is these insects were collected by natives and made into a brilliant red dye, cochineal dye. I myself, why haven't the other cacti used the prickly pear method? Who knows? Cholla, I think, get away with just completely shading themselves with spines. Other cacti, some of the others. To each their own adaptation. But going back to these cochineals, this red color, we don't think about this in our modern day because brightly colored clothing is easy and cheap to buy. We have dyes from petroleum products. Go back a couple hundred years. Dyes were rare. Bright colors were only available to royalty because they cost so much. So when they found this source of red, they exploited it as much as they could. There are tales from the 1600s of English privateers, which is a kind way of saying a pirate that works for the English government, would capture Spanish ships, and they'd find a chest maybe this big filled with these cochineal insects, and that was worth more than anything else on the ship. So that came from these cacti as well, and that was first actually grown down in Central and South America. But you can see a relative of that cochineal insect on the cacti here in Arizona. And if you really, literally, I do this when I do natural history hikes, is I'll take one of my car keys or house key, and I'll pull that white off, and you smash it on your palm, and the innards of the bug come out, and you get this crimson red on you. It's really quite amazing. All right. So many of you have sure seen this one, right? They call that a cow's tongue prickly pear. It's actually the same species as the previous slide, right? It's the same species as this slide. But again, something has happened in the control switches that control cell division. So instead of forming a nice round or oval pad, the cells keep dividing and keep growing until it gets this elongate form that somebody said looks like a cow tongue. And so that's why it is commonly called the cow tongue prickly pear, even though it's the same as the Engelmann before. It is common enough now that actually scientists have given it its own Latin variety linguiformis, and lingua refers to the tongue. So it's a really interesting example of how malleable a plant is in terms of natural selection. This mutation would never have helped this plant survive in the wild. There's no reason why to think that that prickly pear would do any better than this prickly pear. But then this species came along, this species I call the hairless primate, and it liked that adaptation. And so it selected for it, and now we grow that in our gardens. And now it is available and much more common because it survives best in our world. Biology green, a bunny ear prickly pear, really, you like that one. So for those of you who've never seen bunny ear prickly pear, it's also pretty prominently displayed in the beginnings of the botanic garden. They're cute, they're green, they don't have the big spines, but they are covered with 10 million glaucids on those little fuzzy aerial pads. Oh, I planted that in my front yard at my first house many, many years ago. And a few years after I'd planted it, I pulled it all out. It was so horrible to work with. I hated that stuff. They are cute though. They are cute, but you know, wolverines are cute. I wouldn't keep one in my yard. So I left some time for some questions. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing the screen. And I wanted to see if you folks had any questions about cacti or anything else I could answer.
What do we do with cacti that turn yellow from the intense sun? Will that ever turn green again?
Dan, I suspect you're talking about a barrel. And I suspect the yellow you see is at the very top of the tip. Is that correct?
Yes.
That cactus is going to die. I'm sorry. The yellow means that the meristem tissue has died. Now, it may take 5 years for it to actually finish dying, but in my experience, that's not going to come back. You're certainly, certainly can try, but from my experience, I don't have good news for you. I'm sorry.
So what do you recommend putting shade cloth if I get another one when it's really intense heat?
Yeah, shade cloth might be the way to do it. I lost a barrel from that kind of center yelling a few years ago. I've still got the dead carcass in my front yard. I haven't been brave enough to try another one, but maybe shading during the worst of the summer might be one way to try. I see some questions from the chat about purple cacti. Virginia, purple cacti are expressing a pigment called beta-cyanin. And we believe they originally adapted that pigment to act like an antifreeze, to lower the freezing temperature of water so that cactus can actually survive in cold regions. If you go to some of the northern states, there are purple prickly pear. Again, though, because we think it's pretty, we plant it in places that would never have to worry about frost, and we keep it alive there. So that's why you'll see a lot of purple prickly pear here. But the original reason we suspect it evolved was as an adaptation to lower the freezing temperature of the cactus to allow it to live in a colder climate. Cactus juice fertilizer has calcium. Why? Calcium, it could have calcium for one or two reasons. Calcium is a micronutrient for plants, so there could be a reason why they suspect it lacks it. Also, calcium in a calcium carbonate form can help buffer the soil and bring the soil to a slightly alkaline or less acidic condition. So plants actually on their own have these proton pumps. Okay, I'm going way into the biochemistry. They basically slightly acidify the soil around the roots. And that's what allows them to extract the nutrients they need, the nitrates and the phosphates, the positive ions they need. If, however, soil gets overly acidic from other sources like acid rain, this shuts down the plant's ability to extract those nutrients through basically ion exchange. And so that cactus fertilizer might have that buffer in it to help buffer the soil back so that the plant then can be able to extract the minerals it needs. That's my guess on cactus fertilizer. I've never had a problem with cactus growing, except for that poor dead barrel. And the only trick I use is, honestly, the best way for that CAM photosynthesis to work is if you have the highest difference between the nighttime low and the daytime high. So I always water in the dark, because that way the water stays around longer, and it lowers that nighttime temperature to increase the amount of carbon dioxide and carbon the plant fixes. How do the choias cope with the perils of monoculture if they do not sexually reproduce? They clone themselves, and they live fast, die young, and leave a pretty corpse. Amazingly enough, there's actually a moss species in the Pacific Northwest that we know was introduced from Europe. We've done the genetics on it, and there are all of 3 genotypes in the entire moss population of the Northwest. All these ideas of, oh, you need genetic diversity to be stable. Maybe animals need them, but as I've always told my students, animals are kind of the weaker organisms, right? They can't make their own food. They have to eat things. Plants, it appears, aren't that concerned or don't have to worry as much as that kind of genetic stability. I will say, though, in terms of choias, you see these really interesting population dynamics. So if you'll get one in an area, this population will explode, and then it'll all die off. And so that kind of highly dynamic population cycling might be one of the factors that's caused by this amount of genetic monoculture, if you will, this genetic similarity, this cloning. I see you talking about cochineal and lipstick, rouge, cookies. Oh, yes. Yes, it is cochineal red. If you ever see on an ingredient, cochineal red, it is bug juice. I think there's a movie recently about a kid in England who finds King Arthur's sword. And of course he gets Merlin to help him. And Merlin has to make a potion to heal himself. So he needs all these just bizarre ingredients. And it turns out he can get them all by ordering a bucket of chicken and the red Kool-Aid at Kentucky Fried Chicken. And yes, one of the ingredients in that red Kool-Aid is the insect used to color it. It cracked me up in the movie to hear that. Nopalitos are an indigenous food believed to help people stabilize sugar in the bloodstream. Probably the stabilization in the bloodstream is from those mucopolysaccharides that I talked about in the plant. It's just basically that they don't digest as quickly. Mesquite is the same way. The sugars in mesquite take a long time to digest. And the difference is, of course, if you talk about our fine Western diet of ding-dongs, ho-hos, Twinkies, and the like, that refined sugar, it just, boom, gets right into the bloodstream. So you get this spike and drop off. And this is why we think, this is part of why we think the American Indians that live in this area experience something like a 2/3 rate of adult onset diabetes. It's incredibly high. And we suspect the reason why is their genotypes were adapted to these slow release sugars from things like napoles and mesquite. And then very quickly we introduced them to the Western diet of refined sugar with the kind of results that you see. So that's why I would suspect that the nopalitos would be healthy. Other questions? All right. Well, outstanding.
Will a fallen saguaro root?
I'm sorry?
Will a saguaro that has fallen, will it root?
Generally speaking, I have never seen one root. I know that back in the 90s, some people were trying to plant broken saguaro arms. They didn't seem to take. The thing that's interesting about saguaro is because they can cam, sorry about my dogs, because they can cam cycle, and I've seen this in the wild. You can have a saguaro where the trunk is dead, but one of its arms is still alive, and it'll live for years until finally it dries out and dies. But I remember seeing one where not only was the arm still alive, but it had fruit on it, right? And so this ability to take forever to die is something that I think confuses a lot of people in terms of, is the saguaro still alive? Has it survived? There was a study out of the Desert Botanic, the Natural History Museum down in Tucson, the Sonoran Desert Museum, on transplanted saguaros. And it turns out about 90% of transplanted saguaros will never grow anymore. They'll be alive, they'll flower, they'll fruit, whatever, but they'll never add biomass. And ecologically speaking, that's kind of dead. But that's something that if you get one transplanted, I mean, let's say you went and bought a house, you know, right now in one of these desert communities they carved out of the desert, and you bought a saguaro, they're probably only going to guarantee it for a year. It can take at least 2 years to see if that plant will actually survive. And even then, it may survive, but like I said, it may not grow anymore. I mean, we really shouldn't be transplanting them, but for me to actually suggest that and be taken seriously in Phoenix, I don't think is going to happen. All right, I rooted a root arm and it continues to flower 6 years out, but does not grow. Yeah, that's generally speaking what people have found. Kimberly, quest on finding a night blooming cereus. Good luck. That's all I'm going to say. The last ones I saw in the wild were 20-some years ago. They probably have some of the Desert Botanic Garden that you could find, but in the wild, I mean, I found those in North Scottsdale, but I hate to say it, the ones I was looking at 25 years ago probably are underneath somebody's house and long gone by now. You know, it was actually one of the things I joked about. I'd say about 10% of the study sites from my master's thesis are now underneath pavement in parts of Fountain Hills. And so no one will ever know if I have the right data or not, because those places are just gone. But I don't think that's an uncommon story. For those of you who are native to this area, you know, I grew up in Phoenix, and I used to joke that you could tell how old somebody was by asking them where they threw their high school keg parties in the desert. Because every generation, you know, every few years, that had to move further out as the city grew and the city grew. Okay, there are some new cacti introduced to this area. Hopefully not. But again, we use a lot of South American cacti. So cacti, I didn't get too much into their evolutionary history, but cacti are pretty much restricted to what we call the New World, the North America and South America. There is a handful of species in the genus Ripsalis that live in Africa, but we think that was from a long distance dispersal of literally one plant that got to Africa, survived, and then over evolutionary time separated into different species. All right. Well, I could talk all night. You can tell this is what I do. But I'm gonna shut up and I'm gonna let the meeting go on. Thank you all for inviting me.
Thank you so much. Let's give them a round of applause. You can unmute to clap if you want to. You can do it digitally. I'm clapping for all of us. I am going to go ahead. I saw that we have many folks from some of our sister organizations, so I'm going to just go ahead and plop our website right into that chat box there. If any of you are interested, our third cohort is coming up. We welcome you and invite you to apply and be part of our Mary Fellowship. Everyone who is in the meeting is more than welcome to stick around for our more chapter-oriented business piece. But if you were here only for Dr. Sweat, that is enough for me. And you know, you're welcome to stay, but I'm certainly not going to make you. So we'll give it just a couple minutes. And next up, I believe, is Juanita, who is our chapter sponsor. And Juanita, we're so pleased that you could join us here this evening.
Hi, thanks for having me. I wish everyone had their camera on so I can actually see who everyone is. That would be nice if anybody else wants to turn their camera on. So I'm Juanita Armstrong-Holberg. I work with Maricopa County Parks and Rec, and we are, hi Pam, we are going to be your sponsors. And so we're really excited to have all you guys and looking forward to getting to know you guys a little bit better out in the field. So I'll just talk a little bit about my history and my experiences, and then if you guys would like, I could talk kind of what my vision is. What my vision is for like